the things that we need to understand for doing this, right? So initially I thought I will like do the complete introduction, but then Shushruth covered it. So few slides are just basics which we can skip through. And if you guys have any doubt, I can answer on those, right? Otherwise, we'll just concentrate on the major part that we need for the thing, right? So what my idea is to feel free to come up with your own ideas, right? My idea was to develop a Slack bot, right? So a Slack bot is nothing but it's like an automated bot, right, which works on the Slack, right? So I hope you guys would have used Slack, right? Slack is a messaging app, right? And then you can write bots for Slack, right? So Slack exposes a well-defined API. We just have to use the API and then do it, right? And while we do that, we'll also learn about like how to structure an Elixir project, what are the proper idioms that we have to use in a typical project, etc. Right? So I'll just get going. Few slides. You can. These are the things that I think he has covered it, right? So basically, basic differences between Erlang and Elixir. If you guys don't have any questions, I'll just skip through, right? Just let me know. These are like again basic installations and things like that. Again, these are the things you will be needing when you work on the actual project, right? So basically, things like I'm pretty sure he has covered the processes. Mix is something which he didn't cover. So Mix is a package manager for Elixir, right? So it's like what is Ruby gems for the Ruby world, right? Or pip for the Python, right? It's like that. So basically what you do is you specify your dependencies and there's a centralized dependency server where it gets downloaded, right? So Mix also orchestrates compilation, project creation, etc. Right? So Mix also helps you in following some structure for Elixir projects, so that almost all the Elixir projects follows the same Mix structure, right? You create your project using Mix, right? And Mix comes by default installed with the Elixir installation that you have. So you can just type Mix and then it will show you the help, right, for that. These are the things that I think you all know, interactive console and things like that, right? Yeah, this is just to give you a taste of Elixir, right? So basically it's like a parallel PMAP, that whatever he has shown, right? It's like a simplified version of it, right? So basically what internally it's doing is it's like forking 1,000 background processes, and the Erlang VM actually uses all the CPU cores to schedule it and then run it, right? Yeah. So one thing to note in functional programming languages is, right, you will end up creating smaller functions, right, which does like nothing but just the data transformations, right? You will transform data from one format to the other, then you do processing, you transform it back to the older format and things like that. Because there's no centralized state kept, so the state is actually moving together with your function calls, right? So that's one thing which you will feel it's something new when you start writing Elixir code, right? Then yeah, this is basic anatomy of an Elixir project, right? So you use Mix to create a project structure, right? Every Elixir project uses the same project structure, and you do Mix new the project name, it creates a new project, right? So basically, functions lives under modules. So using diff module, whatever he has shown, right? All the functions has to live under a module, right? So you create a module. A module is nothing but just a package for functions, right? It just groups all the functions, right? Then complex projects, right, typically use something called as an umbrella project structure, right? So we can use it for the example, we might not use it. It again depends, right, how you want to structure your application. So typically, a typical example for an umbrella project is like, let's imagine a Java project where you have a UI and where you have some domain logic happening in a different library. So what you do is your domain logic is a library and UI is just reusing it, right? So that's exactly what umbrella project in Elixir, right?
Is it like the microservices, all the microservices?
It's like a libraries, right? So let's say you have a big application, you split that into multiple libraries, right? And then UI component. So what you do is you have a UI component reusing all the libraries. In Elixir, they call it as an umbrella project, right? And Mix helps you in creating umbrella projects. Right?
So an umbrella project can have multiple
Elixir
binaries also, right?
Yeah, it can have multiple binaries. But one thing to note is in Elixir, you typically don't use binaries, right? in Elixir, a typical Elixir project, you can have command line applications, right? But generally the trend is not, you don't write command line applications, right? Instead you will write OTP applications, right? We'll learn about what OTP is in detail, right? So instead you write OTP applications and you start the OTP applications using Mix, right? So Mix will come into play in almost all the areas of your Elixir code, right? So we can probably do Umbrella project, but I don't see a need of Umbrella project. If you need to learn that, we can do it, right? So basically any typical Elixir project, right, will have many processes running inside it, right? As he has shown you one simple example of squaring numbers in parallel, right? So like that, there's going to be like small tiny processes. Some might be long running, some might be short, right? So all short-lived like processes exits immediately. There are long-running processes which I will explain how you create it and how you manage it, right? So a typical Elixir project will have like hundreds of processes running, right? Few will be idle, few will be like actively working on few things, etc. Right? And then all these processes communicate to each other via message passing, right? Which is built into Elixir or Erlang, right? So basically, messages are the first class in Erlang, right? So we'll see what processors and message passing, right? So yeah, each Elixir program consists of many small processors. So there could be long and short running processes, right? Each process will have a separate heap space, right? This is something which is like very different in Erlang, because in typical Java or any other programming languages, right? When you start a green thread or when you start a new thread, right? There's no separate heap space allocated, right? The heap is actually shared, which means whatever allocations that the thread is actually doing, the garbage collector has to go and clean it up, right? In Erlang, what happens is each process itself has a separate heap space allocated, right? So what happens is if your process is short-lived, right? Let's say it allocates few items here and there, right? And your process is short-lived, there might not be need of garbage collection because you're killing the process after that, which means the heap is destroyed, right?
And it goes to the pool that
it just destroyed, right?
No, so
there's no pool,
okay.
right? It gets allocated and then gets destroyed, right? So what happens?
It's basically releasing.
It's releasing. So basically, what happens is that avoids the need of garbage collection in most of the times, right? If your processors are short-lived, right? Because of that, you get very high throughput applications, right? Your garbage collection coming and causing latency is very less, right?
Less frequent.
It's very less frequent, right?
One thing like that, so basically in Java, the garbage collector that you have, for every garbage collection, it has a global log. So for any process when it does garbage collection, the entire application has a log for that particular time. But because it has a shared heap topology, but since your Erlang everything has its own resources, you can just, the garbage collector can work on an individual level. So the entire application doesn't need to be paused. But like in Java and all, the entire application gets paused. So here you'll have a much higher throughput for the same time or same resources.
Yeah. So again, I mean, it all comes from a very careful programming, right? You can abuse it, and then you'll end up like running garbage collectors multiple times. So again, don't take it guaranteed that if you use Elixir, you get garbage collection for free. No, you'll have to code it properly, right? Otherwise, you'll again run into issues, right? So yeah, when the process terminates, all heap data will be cleared, right? Which makes the GC efficient. Then processes communicate together by message passing. The messages that's passed between the processes, right, can be any valid Elixir terms. So it could be maps, it could be arrays, it could be tuples, whatever you want, you can pass from one process to the other, right? Then, no performance penalty like creating many threads. And processes are generally multiplexed and executed in OS threads by their Erlang scheduler. This is like an implementation detail which we need not know. So basically, if you look at any system, right, it has a fixed set of cores, right? So let's say my laptop has 4 cores or 8 cores, whatever it is, right? So technically, only 8 executions can happen at a time, right? But you are free to spawn off like 1,000 or 2,000 threads, right? And the Erlang VM internally actually makes sure that only 8 executes at a time, right? And then it has something called as redirections, right? So based on that, what it does is it kind of it schedules different processes. So let's say you have like 1,000 processes ready to execute. It schedules all 1,000 in this 8 cores, right? That's nothing that we have to worry. It's something which it does internally. And that's the reason why you are able to spawn many processes, right? Without worrying about the hardware limit that you have. Right?
That has a hardcore limit of I think 2000. So each process, so in the scheduler what it does is each process I think it allows 2000 function calls till it puts it at the back of the queue. So the scheduler it first schedules all the processes and each process has maximum 2000 reductions possible. That's a hard-coded value that it can change. And after that it goes to the back of the queue and waits for the rest of the processes to be.
And this is how typically if you look at if you read about actor concurrency patterns, right? This is how most of the actor concurrency libraries are doing, right? They're kind of multiplexing your workload on a set of cores, right? Golang, for example, right? Golang has something called as Go routines, right? Go routines works exactly like this, right? You are free to spawn off like 1,000 or 2,000 Go routines, right? It all gets scheduled depending on how much Go max procs that you set, right? So it's the same concept, right? The only difference when you're comparing to Golang or any other languages, the processes that you schedule here is fully preemptive, right? What that means is, right, if you know about preemption, right? Preemption is a process where let's say you have a long running job to do, right? You do it in slices. You do for 10 minutes, you take it out, you do another job, and you take it out and things like that. When you say Erlang is fully preemptive, right? What it means is it can actually preempt the process at any stage of the process, right? It doesn't matter it's blocking on an IO call, it's blocking on a system call, it doesn't matter, it can preempt it. Or even if you write it very tight loop, very tight for loop, right? It can still preempt, right? That's one key difference in Erlang, and that's what makes it really fast.
What do you mean by tight for loop?
So basically, let's say you start a process where all you do is just a for infinite loop, right?
Sure.
The Erlang scheduler can still remove it from the process execution list and then schedule another process depending on the workload. Right?
Even though it's not technically blocked.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that's called as fully preemptive, right? And that adds to the long running aspect of Erlang. So yeah.
Can you assign priorities also for these processes?
Processes, I think you can assign. I'm not very sure. I think you can. But generally, right, you don't have to deal with that because that's something which the VM does, right? And if it is like super critical where you need like really high priority jobs, right, you would probably architect it in a different way.
You will dedicate hardware.
Yeah, you wouldn't mix it up with your current set of processes.
I mean, when creating the task itself, can I set the priority?
Yeah, but I'm just going to say that you might be able to do that, but I think if you really want something that is super high priority, you would do a dedicated hardware only for that set of processes.
Correct,
Right?
yeah.
You don't mix and match with processes that are not high priority, so that they never have to be
Yeah. So again, that's a very simple example of how you spawn a new process, right? So you say like spawn, you take a function which just adds two numbers, and then so any process that you spawn in Erlang, right, it gets a PID back. The PID is the reference to the process, right? So it's like a name, right? So without PID, you can't call a process, right? So it has to be either a PID or a name, right? We'll see how to register names and things like that later, right? Yeah, so this is another interesting aspect of the whole Erlang system. It's not Elixir, it's Erlang basically, right? Elixir is, I would say, probably like a syntactic sugar on top of the Erlang VM, right? All this goodness is from Erlang. So distributed process, right? So what this does is like typically like let's say you want to do some distributed computing, right? How you generally do it? You will have a queue sitting somewhere, right? You will send a message to the queue, and then you will dequeue from the queue. You will have a set of workers installed in many machines and things like that, and they all do the work, right? That exactly can be done without any of those infrastructure, right? That's the power of Erlang, right? So what it can do is, right, it can actually the processes that we saw, right, the spawn and things like that, can be executed on a different machine, right? So let's say we all have laptops here, we all can form a cluster, right? And then we can say that, okay, I want to do this computation on your computer, right? I want to you do this computation on your computer, right? Or I can get the whole cluster, and then I can schedule the whole job in a round robin fashion, right?
So you are saying we can assign, we have the ability to assign this task to laptop 1
We can
and this to
execute
laptop 2
it.
and laptop
Yeah, we can execute it on any of the computers which is connected to the cluster, right? That
Like an RPC call, right?
it is an RPC call internally, right? It is an RPC call internally. There's a RPC package available in Erlang, which that's what it's getting used
Oh.
internally, right? So when you see there are functions like RPC, multi-core and stuff like that, that's what Erlang is using internally, right? So basically, I mean, this looks very easy to do, right? And Erlang makes it as easy as possible, right? But still, there are like few things that you need to consider, right? You need to make sure that the machines are physically up and running and things like that, right? Then each has to have a same code version, right? And then things like code swapping and all, you will have to be a bit careful of how you do it, right? But let's not deal with any of those today, right? Those are like slightly advanced and we don't have to do it. So, yeah.
How the resources will be managed if you are doing it in a distributed system?
resources as in?
Let's say if I'm depending on particular data, which
Okay.
is present, which will be presented in one of the node.
Oh, then you will have to send the data across.
That's what functional programming, you pass in all the required resources for that process. So each process has, so if you create a new thread in another computer, you have to provide all the resources that thread needs.
So a typical example is, right, let's say you want to do a load testing, right? Have you used Apache Bench, right? The Apache Benchmark tool, right? What it does is you take a website, you can schedule concurrent requests to it, right? So that you can see how it performs under really high load, right? One easy way to do it in Erlang today is to spawn off like 1,000 processes, all does an HTTP request, right? Other way to do that is actually make this distributed so that everyone can actually form a cluster, right? And then do like a really huge workload, right? In your computer, you might be limited to maybe like 10,000 processes, depending on what computer you use, right? But with a cluster,
the file descriptor limit and all will come.
yeah, file descriptor limit, socket limit, everything comes into play, right? So what happens is when you can form a cluster where you can distribute this workload, right? Let's say you have 10 machines, each can run 10,000 requests. Then you get all those things, that many requests, right? So that's the distribution thing, right? And then Erlang makes it very easy that you can schedule it on all these things, right? Provided all the 10 nodes are up and running. But the data that you need, right? So for example, in that case, the URL to crawl or URL to hit will be the data. That has to be passed across, right? Or somehow made it available for the node that the code is going to execute, right? So it could be either a shared DB or anything. It could be shared Redis DB where the master actually pushes and all slaves reads. Right? So yeah, all these machines can form a cluster. Then yeah, in Erlang terminology, we call a machine a node, right? It's a node, right? And then Erlang also, Elixir and Erlang both provides you modules to work with nodes. So you can connect it to a node, you can spawn functions on a node and stuff like that. You can see if the node is alive, is it accessible and stuff like that. Right? So yeah, this is one interesting feature. Connecting nodes are bidirectional. So it's a transitive relationship. So let's say you have A and B, right? And you connect A and B together, right? Let's say you connect from A to B, right? Then typically you will expect A to know B, right? But in Erlang, the B will also know about A. It's always bidirectional, right? So A's cluster will be A and B, B's cluster will be B and A, right? Now think about a C joining in that. So what it will do is A knows about B and C, B knows about A and C knows about A and B, right? It's transitive, right? So think about a huge amount of systems which is joined in the cluster, they all know each other. So anyone can distribute work to anywhere,
So
which
A
is really
can
powerful.
send something and after
To B.
some time B also can send.
Yeah, I mean it doesn't, so yeah, that's something which we'll talk about, right? So basically in Erlang, right? The way that you send messages to processors is again location transparent, right? It doesn't care about the location. All it needs is a PID. That PID could belong to the process that's running on your
Same
machine
or somewhere.
or running somewhere on the network, right?
But
It's the
PID
same effect.
Yeah, PID, the way the numbers are, node ID dot process ID something. The PID identifier itself tells you which node that process belongs to.
Right. That's the implementation detail. That's how Erlang distinguishes between local PID and a remote PID. But as a programmer, you don't have to care about it, right? All you need is a PID and you can talk to it.
So
there is no master slave concept.
Yeah, good.
There is no master slave concept. Here all are good.
Again, master slave concept is, I think, very domain specific. If you want, you can create it, right? But you can always say that okay, the node which came up first is a master, and then rest everybody is a slave, right? You could do that, but generally the connections are transitive, right? It's again like when I say schedule process on something, like you need to tell where to schedule, right? So again, it's your choice whether you want to make it a master slave or a peer-to-peer. It's up to you.
But you need to see that information somewhere, the PID information.
It will be available in the, so Erlang has a dictionary where they keep all the clusters. So you can say node.list, it will tell you everything.
In a large cluster,
Yeah.
let's say like some 10,000 nodes or something like that,
Yeah,
and if one more node is getting added into that,
right.
it may take some time because of the performance may affect the number of nodes in a cluster, right?
Yeah. It again depends on how frequently it can talk to it. They
Let's
keep
say
a health
one
checker.
more node join, that node information available to all other nodes in the cluster may take some time.
Yeah, yes.
Same time.
And also, if suppose if 3 machines are connected, means
Right.
each machine is around 8 core means,
Right.
then 8 into 3 around 24 instances we can run. Or how?
Technically, yes. Yeah.
Technically, yes.
But you can run as many as you want. What gets run is only like whatever your hardware supports, right? So to understand that concept better, right? There's a good video from Rob Pike about concurrency is not parallelism, right? Just watch that. So that will clear the myth around what is concurrency and what is parallelism. They are not same. So I would recommend just watching that video. Yeah. It's nothing to do with Elixir. It's a general concept. Right? But he talks more of from a Go language concept point of view. But it's applicable everywhere. So yeah, I mean that's about the distribution. Then OTP. So I would say anybody who's like actually starting with Elixir or Erlang, right, the most confusing thing that they have to learn is OTP. Right? First of all, the name itself doesn't make any sense in what you do. Right? It's like open telecom platform. Right? What are we doing with this? Right? So the history is like Erlang was created for Ericsson, right? And Ericsson was primarily in the telecom domain, right? So Erlang never meant to be a general use programming language. It was created very specifically for Ericsson's purposes, right? So what happened was like all the naming that they have done is very specific to the telecom domain, right? So what they've done is like OTP is like OTP is some framework that they created on top of all the Elixir thing, right? It's written on Erlang, right? What it does is it provides you very basic components to create very highly available systems, right? Like 99% availability kind of systems, and they are fault tolerant, and then they are distributed, right? So that's why if you see like when you make phone calls, right, you hardly get errors in them saying that the system is unavailable and things like that, right? I'm not saying today like this is wrong back, right? That's the reason why the naming is like that, but yeah. So basically, the main component that we will be dealing with in OTP is something called as Gen server, right? This is again very cryptic name. So basically, Gen server is generic server. That's all. So it's like a server part in the server client like there. So basically, it implements a server, right? Now, I mean, explaining Gen server itself is very difficult. I'll try my best. So basically, generally, Elixir or Erlang projects usually contains a bunch of Gen servers, right? So what is a Gen server? Internally, it's nothing but a process, right? It's nothing but an Erlang process, right? But what it does is it has a messaging loop in it, right? So that you can keep sending messages to it. It can answer it. It can respond back, right? Now, if you typically do that, let's say if you want to create a Gen server on your own, right? The way that you will create is you will have two loops, one for receive and one for one loop, one receive loop, right? What that will do is that will wait for all the messages that's coming into the process, and according to the message, it does some action, sends the response back. That's Gen server, right? But what it does is it actually provides you a lot of hooks for handling the messages. It also handles timeouts for you. It also handles the whole crude code that you have to write for the message passing. So if you guys are familiar with an even loop, right? This is something like an even loop. A Gen server is something like can be picturized as an even loop, right? But you use Gen server a lot, and then Gen server fits nicely into the whole OTP ecosystem, right? So OTP has something called as an application. OTP has then a lot of things like Gen server, Gen event, Gen stage, and stuff like that, right? So we'll deal with only Gen server in this one. Right? So each Gen server internally is an Erlang process. Communicating to Gen server is through message passing. Again, you send messages to the Gen server. Gen server accepts it and then responds back. Okay. So Gen server is nothing but an abstraction over the normal message passing, right? So basically, it's like a contract which says that okay, every Gen server should have these predefined functions, and then you can interact with it, right? One simple example that I can tell you probably to understand Gen server better is let's assume you're creating a simple Elixir application which actually goes and do a Google search, right? Let's say you type something, it hits the Google's API, right? Google's website using HTTP libraries, and then get the response back. Right? In that case, right, you typically, if you do it in a very simple Elixir way, you will create a module for Google search called Google search, and then you will say that Google search for this parameter, right? Which internally does an HTTP call, right? Now what happens is, right, let's say the network was down or Google returned you some error. What happens? Your application crashes, right? Now typically you will abstract this whole thing into a Gen server, right? So what happens is when something crashes, only the Gen server crashes. You don't crash your application, right? Again, there are supervisors coming into picture.
But Gen server is within our app only, right? So that doesn't impact.
I'm saying in a simple terms, just to understand, you're isolating things, right? But you can control it by handling the errors and things like that. That we'll see later, right? But just to understand the concept of Gen server.
This is the concept of fail-proof that they say.
It is, yeah, in a way.
This is one of them where it
them.
makes the system fail-proof.
Right. You're kind of isolating all your moving parts, which could possibly fail, right? You're interacting with an external system, which could possibly fail, right? So you're kind of isolating it into a Gen server, so that the Gen server is available there, right? And any like side effects that's happening to the actions that you're doing is applicable only to the Gen server, right? It's not getting applicable to your actual source code or your actual application, right? Or other processes doing other parts of your application, right? So let's say there are some other process doing some computation. That won't affect because the Google was down, right? Things like that. So you'll see that later. So yeah, this is another thing. So like any Erlang process, you can use supervisors to supervise it, right? So Erlang processes has a concept called supervisor, right? So it's like you run a process, right? The process can get killed at any time, right? Now that's not good for a long-running process, right? Let's say I made an error, like a request which is like really bad, right? Which caused the Gen server to exit, right? Then it means that when I send the request again, there's no one to process because it's exited, right? But for a long-running application, what happens is you typically have a supervisor attached to the Gen server, right? Or to the process. So what happens is the supervisor actually traps exits. When the process dies, the supervisor will get to know that the process has died. It will restart it from a known state. So it's like errors are bound to happen, right? You can't control errors, right? Even if you check all possible errors, there will be still some unhandled exception happening at some point of time, right? But you're making sure that right? So this is a simple example of a Gen server, right? It's like a stack which you say use Gen server. So Gen server is nothing but a behavior that Elixir gives. So behavior is nothing but it's like an interface, right? So an interface in Java, right? So where you say that okay, every module should have these many methods implemented, right? If you don't implement, Elixir will provide a default for you, right? Erlang won't do that, but Elixir is nice and then they do that, right? So here, right, if you see, it's a simple stack here. So if you see here, this is where we are starting the Gen server. So we are saying that Gen server.start link, start a stack with an argument called hello, right? Now what it does is you get a PID back. This PID is your reference to the process, right? Now if you want to do anything to the process, you always use the PID. Let's say typical operation is push something to the stack, right? So I will say Gen server.call, pass a PID and then say pop. So this pops from the stack, right? I can say push to the stack, right? Now if you see, there are two ways that I have called it. There is a Gen server.call and I have also used a Gen server.cast, right? So the biggest difference is call is synchronous, cast is asynchronous, right? So if you want a replay back from Gen server, you use call. If you don't want a replay from a Gen server, you use cast, right? So it's like I want to tell Gen server to download the whole internet. It's going to take long time and I can't wait for a replay. I'll tell it that okay, you go and download it, right? And then let me know by sending a message, right? So that happens internally and I will be doing something else. Suddenly I'll get a message saying that oh, the download is ready, right? That's the cast, right? When you do call, so call happens, it's like I want to get the response immediately, right? Things like are you alive, right? I don't want to get it after some time, I just want to get it immediately, right? So that's where, so call is blocking, right? So when you do Gen server.call, you get blocked.
So cast is async, it happens
Cast
in
is not blocking, right?
background.
It's background, right? And you have to make it background, but the concept is if you want to do background jobs, you
Then
use
you
cast.
call.
How do you configure the callback in Rust?
So basically, Gen server provides you these callbacks. So you have majorly handle call and handle cast, right? So when you do call here, right, the handle call gets called. When you do cast, the handle cast gets called. Again, the arguments are pattern matched, right? So here you are saying that the first argument is it's a tuple with an atom called push, right? And another atom called world. So basically the action is push and then this is the argument. You're going to push the atom world into the stack, right? So what it does is it calls the handle cast here where it matches the push and it assigns the world into the item. And then it assigns the item into the internal state of the Gen server.
So what exactly happens after that? So after handle cast, we are saying no reply and then we did something. So what is that?
So every callbacks, right? Handle call, handle cast, and every callback has to replay with a specific structure, right? A predefined structure, right? That is defined by the Gen server behavior, right? So if you are so look at here, right? You're popping something from the stack, right? In that case, you are replying to the client saying that here is the pop data, right? That time you use an atom called replay. These are predefined, right? And then this is the replay that you are sending, right? And this is the remaining state.
So reply should be followed by anything.
Replay followed by like
So-
what is your replay and the new state.
Oh, that pattern also should match.
That pattern also should match.
So what I am replying and the new state.
New state. So
I can't
basically-
add 4 parameters there. I have to. What I meant was, if we have reply and then the condition and the state, current condition and the state. So I can't add a 4th param. It's
You can't.
predefined that
You
it
can't.
is 3 and then
If
this
you
is how
want
it
a
should
fourth one,
pattern.
right, or if you want to expand this replay, you can make this a rich data structure like tuples, maps.
Okay, but ultimately it should be 3 because it has to match something.
Correct. Right. So the reason why they're doing it is, right, so remember this is the functional programming language. You don't have any way to keep the state. So you keep circulating the state. So what it's doing is it's doing some action. It's returning a new state. Now when I do one more call, right, the handle call that I get will be the state that I passed before, right? It's like think about it's like a loop where you keep passing the state to every action, right? That's exactly what it is. All it's doing is it's abstracting that loop from you and then asking you to reply in a specific way, right? So here you are replying, here you are not replying because it's a cast. You're saying that I don't have anything to replay. All I have is I know I'm supposed to push this item into the stack. So I pushed it and then created a new state where the new item is also present. And then returned it back.
In a cluster environment, this gen server could be running on any other node, right?
Yes. Yeah. So in that case, right, the storage also has to be distributed. Otherwise you will get errors, right? So that's where if you try to distribute a stack, it might not be a proper use case for it, right? But you can probably create a distributed hash table, right? Where you can pick a node based on the hash value, right? So you know always you will land upon a correct node because the hash always matches, right? But this probably will be a bad example for a distributed one. So yeah, I mean he has covered tasks and agents.
So the previous example that you gave,
Yeah.
the gen server I'm still identifying with PID only.
You are still identifying with PID only.
What's the issue when it's going to be in a distributed setup?
So you will still have to identify it.
Yes,
Right?
so
So
that-
you
that
can
one-
identify it in 3 ways. Right? One, you can identify it using a PID. One, you can identify it using a name. All the gen servers can actually register to a global registry
Yeah.
which Erlang provides and then use that. Right? These are the 3 ways.
Yes.
So without that you can't identify it.
Yeah, but what is the issue in that code?
No, I'm talking about the distributing the data. So let's say stack example, right? If you try to distribute it, right? What happens is my push request might go to one of the nodes and my pop request might go to some other node where the push wasn't happened. So the data has to be distributed.
But the thing is that gen server process that's holding the state, that's the single process that's holding the state.
Correct.
That state will always get updated. So no matter if I do pop in one and push in the other, the data is
No,
still
right.
going to be
These are
consistent.
individual gen servers
Okay,
running on
you are
each node.
creating each node with gen. Okay, I was thinking about one
No,
gen server.
not one gen server. So if there is only one gen server running in one node and everybody is using that, then you will get the same data, right? If you have like this stack running in every node, then you have like, let's say you have 10 nodes, you will have 10 stacks, right? So tasks he has covered. Agents is something which you will have to use when we do the workshop. So agent is nothing but another process which you use to keep the state, right? And you rarely use it, right? Because the state is always passed across in the function itself, right? Let's say in case you can't do that, right? You will need something like an agent, right? Which is like another process, right? Where you keep the state, and you keep asking the agent, okay, can you give me the correct state? Now set this as a new state, right? Yeah, this is something which is very different when you try to write an Elixir code, right? The way you write handle errors, right? Like one general practice is explicit error handling, right? Where every function returns you a tuple, right, with the success or error, right? And if it is an error, there is a reason also, right? This is what followed in Golang, Rust, and all these languages follow the same pattern, right? Every function returns you a value, right? The good thing with Elixir is because Elixir has pattern matching, right? It can pattern match against the return values easily, right? So look at this code, right? I'm trying to generate a URL, and then I'm going to use a library called HTTP portion, and then get the URL, right? I'm sending a get request to the URL, right? Now it can have two possible responses. It could return me a 200 status code. It could also return me an error response. So I can handle it in a nice way so that I know that okay, when there is an error happen, I need to handle it, right? In this method, so if you look at the HTTP portion.get, it is actually giving you the errors as return values, right? So that's one generally used way where you handle errors, right? The
How
other,
do you figure out if it falls something other than these two?
you don't have to figure out if there is. So the
Yeah.
beam
So
will
here
just
they are actually
fail.
trying to capture the second one, all kinds of errors.
Underscore. It's pattern matching, right? So anything match to underscore. So if you want to handle a case which is not these two, you add another one where you say underscore and what you want to do in that exceptional case. But generally you tend not to do that because I mean you don't know, like, I mean it's like catch all, right? You put a catch without a specific exception. Anything goes under that. You will create more problems by doing it. So generally you know that okay, these are the possible return values, and then if that is not the case, you let it crash, right? So that you can fix it. Right?
Figure out what.
Yeah, you can figure out why it failed, right? The other approach that they use is try catch rescue. This is like the common try, throw exception, catch it, and then rescue from it, right? This is very rarely used, right? In the whole Elixir code base, you won't find much occurrences of Elixir in Elixir with a try catch. Primarily because most of them tend to use the return value for error messages, right? Or they use something called as let it crash. Right? We'll see how we handle that, right? Here the biggest difference in try catch rescue, the reason why we have tried to use try catch rescue here is what it's trying to do is it's getting a JSON, right? And it's trying to pattern match on that JSON, right? And then trying to extract some values out of it, right? Now, since this JSON was coming from an external provider, right? We don't know when they changes the JSON structure, right? So if they changes the JSON structure in Erlang, pattern match errors are fatal, right? It's like if the pattern can't be matched, the whole VM gets shut down, right? Or an error throws up, right? And then, like, if you are not catching it, it will kill your process, right? So in this case, what happens is, right, we need the niceness of the pattern matching so that we can extract data out of it easily. If I have to write it the other way, I have to go via map.get, map.get, map.get. Let's say I'm going like 5 levels nested JSON. I need to like go that many level deep. Here I'm easily getting it, right? But the problem with this code is like if the vendor changes the JSON format, my code will fail, right? So instead of taking the whole application down, right, we have tried to rescue it, and then if it is only the match error, we'll say that okay, I mean we don't know how to process this, right? Rather than killing the whole system, right? And only these kind of exceptional cases you use try and rescue. Otherwise you don't use it.
Does the whole VM go down, or does that particular thread or
It depends on how you have done that. Right? Let's say this code was in a Gen server, which was supervised, right? Then only the Gen server gets killed and then it gets restarted, right? But again, just to ensure that it's difficult. So depending on where it was coded, right? If it was on the actual main process, right, it might kill it. Right?
So I have one doubt here. So this map, assume we ended up with the match error. So someone else is called this map,
Okay.
and they're expecting something. So when there's a match error here, then that should also handle a match error there.
Correct.
So then the stack goes on. Then we'll end up using try and rescue there also.
No, we will not.
Or we are doing a pattern match.
Right. You see, because we have, so we by doing rescue we said that okay, don't bubble this up, right? It's done there, right?
Yeah, no, when it's done means it doesn't happen here. Someone else is trying to call this.
Here,
And trying to.
what you can do now is instead of bubbling the error up, you can return a status. You can return a tuple saying error at some value.
Okay,
It's
and
like
they will have
it's
to
like
pattern match that.
it's
with
like
the
I'm
match
doing
figure
the
out.
try catch into an explicit error handling.
It's like Java try catch, right?
Correct.
It won't
It's like-
bubble.
it won't
if you
bubble.
are doing a catch.
Right. So it's like I'm catching this unexpected error, right? And then I'm converting that into a return value and then sending it back.
Okay.
Right?
So along with in the math error, we actually maybe we'll send error as error and something else
Correct.
as part of
So
it.
in
We'll
this
send it.
code, it's not visible because the return value comes from here.
Okay.
Right? That's why it's not visible.
Okay.
Instead of this one, right, the above example, with the underscore, can we do the same thing here there also? Pattern
Yeah, we
matching,
can.
right?
Yeah.
Like, I'll just try to differentiate it. Like
No,
with the pattern
so-
match itself, you can do that error handling, right?
Right. So generally, why you do this is, right, when you're interoping with some libraries, right, where they haven't done these kind of return value error messages, and you have no other way other than just catching what they throw, right, or things like this, right. In this case, we just want to do the pattern matching here, right. But here I have no way to catch it if the pattern matching fails. So that's the reason why it is used here, right. Generally, you don't use this.
You got pattern match against match error. You can be pattern match against the return value because match error will kill the process there. If that's what you're asking.
No, what I'm asking is the below code, can we write like case state?
No, you can't.
No, you can't. That you can't.
cannot.
You can't.
No.
Exceptions
Because-
there cannot be hand pattern match.
Yeah.
Exception can be called.
So again, I mean, don't try to use try catch rescue unless it is really required, because that generally people don't use it. Then this is the most heard like statement when people talk about airline or Elixir, right? They just say that okay, it's like very fail proof, just let it crash, right? I would say this comes with a lot of warnings and cautions, right? Don't say that okay, let it crash, right? That's not true always, right? It again depends on how you structure your applications, how different parts of your applications are supervised, etc. Right? If you screw it up, it still crashes. Right? So there's nothing, no silver bullet. So here, yeah. So we'll see how actually this let it crash statement of like emerged, right? So if you see in Erlang, right, the processes, right, Erlang is not only providing you the ability to spawn off processes, but also providing an ability to link them, right? So you say that, okay, I am process 1, I am spawning process 2, right? I can link these P1 and P2, so that anything happens on P2 will also take down P1, right? And that's like a big chain. So the P2 can be P3, P3 can be P4, anything happens on P4 gets bubbled up to P3, P3 to P2, P2 to P1. Right? And that's called as process linking, right? And that's very important to understand the whole let it crash thing, right? So here is something like I'm introducing you guys to something called a supervisor, right? And then you will end up using supervisors a lot when you write Elixir code. The supervisor is nothing but like someone looking at you, right? It's like if you crash, he will come and help you to come back to the initial state, and then you will start working again, right? So if you look at the code here, right? So basically it's like an OTT application, and that's what you have done here, right? When the application starts, right, you're going to set up few supervisors. So in this case, bc.store is like a worker, right? It's like a Jet server, right? And then you're telling Elixir that okay, supervise the bc.store. So anything happens in bc.store gets reported, but the supervisor will restart it, right? So it gets reported, but supervisor will restart it, so the next operation continues as if nothing happened, right? That's the whole philosophy of supervisor, and you can control how supervisor works, right? You can say I need a 1-for-1 supervisor, I need a, there are different strategies for supervisor.
So the bc.store is another Gen server, right?
bc.store is a Gen server.
So merging the previous example, that stack in the
Right.
Gen server, right?
Yeah.
And
In that
this
case,
is Strat.
if you make stack as a Gen server, then stack can actually go here.
Yeah, exactly. My question is like, let's say there are a lot of process push some data to the stack.
Right.
Now that Gen server crashed somehow,
Correct.
will that data will be available?
Data will be lost.
Lost.
Right? So supervisor gets restarted. Supervisor restart into a non-state, which will be an empty stack. Right? So that is this argument.
Oh,
Right? So again, right, that's a very good question. So how do you actually recover that data? Right? That's why I told you about agents. So what you do is your stack won't keep data within the stack process. Instead, it has an agent running, and it keeps data in the agent. Right? So what happens is even if the stack crashes, the agent is not crashing. Right? The agent is supervised, and you are doing very less operations on agent,
maybe
which
just
will
keep
make
the
it
data.
crash. Right? So it's like you're separating that out, so that your agent will always hold the data. Your stack is just taking data from agent and giving it back.
So basically, in a normal Java or any other application,
Right.
like you have a Redis server to keep the stack,
Something like that.
and read it from there when you
Correct.
start.
So again, it is again proving that the let it crash is not free, right? You will have to design for it,
Right.
Otherwise, it won't happen, right? So that supervises. I'm going a bit fast. If you just stop me if you have questions. Yeah, you will need all these basic debugging techniques when you do the workshop, right? So we'll see like quickly what are the things. So you will need there's something called as IEX.pry. So what it can do is, if you are running something, you can write the line IEX.pry, right? Your code actually stops there, right? And then you will be dropped into an interactive console where you can inspect the variables and stuff like that, right? It's like Ruby also has a pry.
It's
right?
more like a breakpoint and then.
It is like a breakpoint, yeah. But the only thing is you can't set breakpoint, like you can just click it and then run it. This is not
You
like
need
that.
to
You have to
put
write
this
the
stuff
code,
there.
then compile it and then run it. So the other one is like io.inspect or logger.inspect. These are the things that you generally use, right? Inspect is something which Elixir provides, which kind of it disassembles the data structure. If you give it a map, it will just break it down and then show you what the contents of it, right? Then yeah, this is very important. So observer.start. So what it does is it shows you an Erlang graphical user interface where you can see actually the whole supervision tree, how many processes are running, how much memory is allocated, when was the garbage collection happened last time, everything is visible there, right? What's the CPU utilization, etc., etc. Right? So this you go to an IEX console and then say observer.start. You will start an observer and then you will be able to see all these things. Right? This also comes with the Elixir installation, or in fact Erlang installation. So yeah, and this is IEX minus S mix, right? You have seen IEX, right? But if you pass that additional 2 arguments, what it does is, let's say you are in a mix project and then doing this, it will load the whole mix project into IEX, so that all your mix related things and all your modules, everything, your OTP application, everything will be up and running, right? Yeah, this is, maybe you will use it, but process pooling, right? Again, as he told, right, Erlang is like very easy to spawn off processes. You can abuse your system by processing 10,000 processes and stuff like that, right? All will work very well if you're doing all in-memory calculations and then small number additions and all, right? The whole statement goes for a toss when you interact with external systems, right? But they have limits, right? Let's say you're querying a Postgres database and you try to spawn 10,000 processes. Postgres dies, right? It runs out of socket limit, it runs out of the TCP limit, etc. Right? So you will have to limit the number of processes that can access an external system, right? Or let's say like you created some Slack bot which is like going and reading from the Slack API. Slack guys will block you if you just send 10,000 requests all at once, right? So again, you need to say that, okay, my rate limit is like 2 at a time or 3 at a time, right? So that's where the process pooling comes into picture, right? So what you do is, even though you have 10,000 processes, right, you try to limit it, right? You say that only 2 processes can run at a time, right? And you do it very, you take the decision. You say that, okay, this gen server is actually accessing an external API. I don't want to abuse the API. I want to say that, okay, I want to control it so that only 2 requests goes at a time. Once that is done, the next 2 requests. I'm free to spawn off like 1,000 requests, but only 2 gets executed at a time, right? It's like a big road. Suddenly, like just narrowing it and then like making it like a line, right? So yeah. So yeah, too many parallel processes could cause problems. So there's a good library called Poolboy, right? So Poolboy, it's not built into Erlang, so you'll have to use a library called Poolboy, right? What you do is like Poolboy, you can say that, okay, what's your maximum limit, what's your maximum overflow and stuff like that, right? So I'll show you a real-time example here. This is our Elixir code which actually connects to the Cassandra database, right? So Cassandra like can't take too many connections. So if you see here, if you see the structure, right, this is nothing but a supervisor, right? The whole pool boy itself works like fits into the whole OTP like OTP terminology. Right? You have supervisors, gen servers. Pool boy itself is a gen server. Right? So what you are doing here is right. You have a pool option. So you say that my pool size is 50, right? And then I can overflow probably to 100, right? So what it's saying is at a time I will have 50 open connections to Cassandra, right? Now if my workload is above 50, right, I will expand it to 100. So total I will have 150, right? If it is expanding above that, I will put them into a queue till these guys finishes, right? So that's like even the massive set of processes you are like bringing into a sequence, right?
So
that
pool boy internally will do the queuing and
pool boy internally does
outbound
that, yeah. Right? So it's like if you have used TFS, right, the old TFS, it's like you check out one guy, you use him, then you check in that guy, right? But that check out and check in can be a transaction. So pool boy has something called as a transaction, right, which does this internally for you.
Like a thread pool.
It's like a thread pool, yes, exactly. It's like a thread pool, right? But you can control it. And you can supervise it. So everything that you run under it is supervised. Right? So even if one worker crashes, right, the pool boy's supervisor will restart it. Okay? So I mean, it's very interesting to visualize this. It's like a big tree with a lot of processes running, a lot of supervisors looking after. There are supervisors who's looking after supervisors, right? So it's like big chain. So if your supervisor dies, some other supervisor will come and restart it, which internally restarts all the childs. The ecosystem is very powerful, but there's a very steep learning curve, and then takes some time to get adjusted with all these things. Yeah.
So what is I have one more thing. What is any illustration where you think supervisor is being supervised by another supervisor? So
I mean,
any
supervisor could also
illustration?
fail, right?
No, any illustration that you think in real world?
Yeah, I mean, real world, even in our project, right, we are using it. We have 2 levels of supervisors, right? We have like one level of supervisor which actually supervises the Cassandra stores. And then we have one more level of supervisor which actually takes another clients plus the supervisor, right? So typically it's a tree, right? It's like a hierarchy. So yeah, you will come into, so it's again, you break that down based on like what kind of errors has to be bubbled up, what needs to be restarted at what point, etc. So yeah, I don't think there's a very simple explanation of when you will use that. It's just very use case specific.
Is there any way instead of having another private supervisor, internet supervisor, is it possible the child restarts the supervisor?
Child
Is there
restarts the supervisor?
like bidirectional supervision?
I don't think it's not possible. Because the way supervisors are working is by utilizing something called as monitoring in the whole process system, right? So when a process is starting, right, the supervisor will say that, okay, I want to monitor this guy, right? So it is internally telling Erlang VM that whatever happens to this process, let me know, right? So if that process dies, the supervisor gets a message, and the supervisor knows how to start it again. He will start it again. That's a simple supervisor, right? So let's get to the Slack board, right? So Slack board is what we're going to build it today, right? So this is a fine example of Slack board. Somebody is like saying, I love you Slack board is saying that back to you, right? It's like it can take any command, it can respond back, right? This is very useful in projects. Like in a couple of projects we had Slack boards where you say that, okay, deploy the current build. The Slack board will take it, he will trigger a Jenkins job which goes and pushes the build into one of the QA machines, and then it will come back and say that, okay, build is deployed.
So for that means trigger the build, that it has to understand that means that has to be translated somewhere.
Correct.
Oh.
We'll see that how to do that, right? So I'm trying to I'm hoping we'll try to see like a lot of Elixir concepts while doing this. But again, like time, I'm not sure how much we can cover, but let's try our best on whatever we can do. Right? So basically, it's going to be an automated bot which can perform any helpful task. So Slack exposes a well-defined API, right? Then bots work over HTTP and WebSockets. We'll use a WebSocket approach, much easier to do it, right? Then the bots are actually fun, right? So these are like something around to structure functions, error handling and fault tolerance, how Elixir makes distributed computing easy, right? I'm not sure we'll have time for the last one, but last one is very interesting. So what my plan is to have is to actually have, so basically this will have two parts. One, the Elixir project which actually connects to the Slack API. The second part which actually understands how to parse the messages that's been sent to it, right? Now the message parser can be distributed. So each of you can write a type of message parser which understands a type of message and then start it on your machine which joins the cluster, right? Which means I just have to start the message processor, I will have ability to handle another type of message, right? That's like one beautiful way to illustrate how the distribution works. But let's see if we have time, we can do that, right? Yeah, so this is like an imaginary architecture that I put for Slackbot. You need not follow the same. You're free to follow whatever you like. Right? So I'm visualizing Slackbot to have two parts. One, a Slack client and a message processor, right? And then Slack client will have the responsibility to connect to the Slack, handling messages coming from the Slack, right? Whoever is sending that a message, handling that. Then some mixed task to start the client and things like that, right? Then message processor will handle the messages that the client is actually sending, right? The incoming messages. It tries to see who can process the message, right? It will have multiple nodes. So this node will be your computer, this node will be your computer, this node will be your computer. It will have many processors, right? So some guy will understand like what's today's time, right? A message like that. Some guy will understand deploy the current build, right? So it's like some guy can understand multiple message formats. Right? So it's like that's a basic simple thing that I could come up with. Depending on how we go, we can restructure it. Right? Now, yeah, we're almost done. So yeah, so these are the things that you need. Ensure you have Slack installed on your system. I will create a test Slack team where we all can join and then play with it. Right? Then Slack has a boards page where you can go and register your board, give it some funny name, and then your board will be online, right? You will also get a bot authentication token. That's what you will need to use in the workshop, right? Then keep the authentication token ready. Then ensure you can see the board user inside the team. So if you just go to Slack, you will see this guy as a board user, right? You can click on it, send a message, and you can update it, right? Then yeah, how do you think this problem in Elixir, right? So basically, Mix new Slackbot will create a new project for you, right? It will create the whole project structure, right? Which we can try together, right? Yeah, this is what I'm thinking: a Gen server which manages the connection to the Slack API. The whole Slack API will be isolated in a single Gen server, which is of course supervised, right? So even if Slack API gets down, WebSocket gets closed, proxy errors, all these things are isolated, right? Then yeah, Gen server which can process messages. This should also consider the available nodes. This is the message processor part, which is another Gen server, right? You're getting the concept of it, right? So that's going to be another Gen server, right? Then there will be Slackbot module, which is nothing but an OTP application. We'll start to hook all these Gen servers and then supervise this, etc. Right? Yeah, so this is more reach. Yeah, each message processor can be Gen servers. Then I just put out some possible message process. We could have a weather report. We can take it using the Yahoo or Google APIs, right? Top rated item in Hacker News, right? Anything under the sun can be done using this. So that's it. That's good. So that's the test team that I have created. If you go here, elixir-workshop.slack.com, you can actually so we can do this after lunch. We'll just break for lunch and then we'll do it. But if you go to that, you can send a request to join the team, and then you can create bot users under that. Right? That's it.